The air in the courtroom wasn't just cold, it was suffocating thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken contempt. On one side sat Alistair Finch, a titan of industry, whose net worth eclipsed the GDP of a small nation. His Brioni suit was a silent testament to his power, his boredom a weapon. Across from him, his wife of 22 years, Evelyn Hayes, looked like a ghost at a feast. He glanced at her, a woman he hadn't truly seen in a decade, and performed the most dismissive theatrical eye roll imaginable. It was a gesture for his lawyers, for the press, a declaration that this whole affair was a tedious inconvenience. But he was about to learn a very hard lesson. Sometimes the quietest people hold the loudest truths, and the ghosts you ignore have a way of coming back to claim everything you hold dear. The silence in their Fifth Avenue penthouse was a physical presence. It clung to the marble floors, absorbed the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, and muted the perpetual symphony of New York City below. For Evelyn Hayes, this silence was the soundtrack of her marriage to Alistair Finch. It had crept in slowly over 22 years, a gradual replacement for laughter conversation, and finally, even the performative arguments. Now it was an entity in itself, a house guest that had long overstayed its welcome. Alistair lived a life of loud declarations. His company, Finch Capital, didn't just acquire businesses, it consumed them, stripping them for parts and profit, with a ferocity that made Wall Street both admire and fear him. His voice boomed in boardrooms, his laughter echoed at charity galas, where he signed seven-figure checks with a flourish, and his name was a constant murmur in the financial pages of the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times. Yet at home, he was a spectre of his public self. He moved through the sprawling apartment like a man in a hotel lobby, his presence noted but not truly felt. Evelyn, on the other hand, had become a master of the quiet arts. She was the curator of their perfect life, the silent partner in the brand of Alistair Finch. She orchestrated dinners for visiting dignitaries, selected the art that adorned their walls, which Alistair would later claim as his own astute discovery, and managed the complex ecosystem of their homes in the Hamptons, London, and St. Bart's. She was in the eyes of their rarefied social circle, the perfect billionaire's wife, elegant, discreet, and utterly unthreatening. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic explosion, but a quiet, soul-crushing realization. It happened on a Tuesday. Alistair was featured in a glossy magazine profile, hailed as a self-made visionary. The journalist asked him about the early days, the genesis of Finch Capital. It was pure grit. Alistair had said, his photo showing him leaning against a skyscraper, the city at his feet. I was working out of a tiny office fueled by coffee and a singular vision. I developed a proprietary analytical model, a way to see value where no one else could. It was my secret sauce. Everything, and I mean everything, grew from that. Evelyn read the words while sitting on a silk-upholstered chaise in her dressing room, a room larger than the apartment she'd lived in before meeting him. His secret sauce, his singular vision. A cold, familiar knot tightened in her stomach. She closed her eyes and saw not their penthouse, but a cramped university library, the scent of old books in the air. She saw herself a brilliant postgraduate mathematics student, hunched over terminal lines of code, glowing green on the black screen. She remembered the thrill of creation as she designed an algorithm, a predictive model for assessing undervalued assets based on non-linear risk factors. It was her thesis, her passion project. She called it Helios because it was meant to shine a light on hidden things. She had shown it to a young, ambitious Alistair Finch, a business student she'd fallen for, who had big dreams, but lacked a truly unique edge. He had been fascinated, mesmerized. "This is it, Ev," he had whispered, his eyes gleaming with an intensity she mistook for love. "This is the key." He'd promised her the world a partnership in every sense of the word. They would build an era together. She dropped out of her PhD program to support his burgeoning business. The algorithm her Helios became the bedrock of Finch Capital. In the whirlwind of their early success, the long hours, the thrilling climb, her contribution was never formalized. It was just our secret, then my secret, and finally it was erased from the story altogether. He had built his kingdom on her intellectual bedrock, and then slowly, methodically, bricked her into its foundations until she was invisible. That Tuesday, reading that article, Evelyn Hayes finally understood. She wasn't living in a gilded cage. She was haunting it. Her decision was as quiet as the life she now led. There was no shouting, no thrown porcelain. She simply picked up her phone and called a number she'd kept for years, a number for a law firm known not for splashy celebrity divorces, but for methodical, complex corporate litigation. "Good afternoon. This is the office of Portia Kane," the receptionist answered. "My name is Evelyn Hayes," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the seismic shift occurring within her. "I need to schedule a consultation regarding a dissolution of a partnership." Alistair Finch received the news not from his wife, but from his chief legal counsel, a man named Arthur Vance from the powerhouse firm of Whitman and Locke. Arthur was a man who measured his life in billable hours and courtroom victories, and his tone was one of weary annoyance, as if dealing with a minor supply chain disruption. "Alistair, we've received a petition," Arthur said over the phone, the sound of sirens faintly screaming in the background of his call from downtown Manhattan. "It's from Evelyn's counsel. She's filed for divorce." Alistair was in the back of his chauffeured Maybach, scrolling through market reports on a tablet. He didn't even look up. "On what grounds?" "The usual, irreconcilable differences." "Fine." Alistair grunted. "Call her. Offer her the Hamptons house, the flat in Kensington, and a lump sum. Say 20 million. No, make it 25. That's more than generous. I want this handled quietly and quickly. And Arthur," he added a flinty edge to his voice, "remind her about the prenuptial agreement. It's ironclad. She gets what's stipulated, not a penny more." He hung up, dismissing the matter from his mind as easily as he would a bad trade. The prenup drafted by Arthur's predecessors 2 decades ago was his shield. It was a brutal document that clearly demarcated his business assets, Finch Capital, and all its holdings, past, present, and future, as his sole and separate property. Evelyn had her own accounts funded by a generous allowance and certain personal properties. To him, the divorce was a simple transaction, a line item on his personal balance sheet. He underestimated Evelyn, and he vastly underestimated her choice of lawyer. Portia Kane was not the kind of lawyer Alistair was used to. She didn't have a corner office overlooking Central Park. Her firm, Kane and Associates, was housed in a modest but respectable building in Midtown, one that valued discretion over ostentatious displays of wealth. Portia was sharp in her late 40s, with an encyclopedic knowledge of contract and intellectual property law. She had made her name dissecting corporate structures and finding the hairline fractures that others missed. When Evelyn Hayes walked into her office, Portia saw not just a scorned wife, but a foundational partner whose contribution had been deliberately and systematically obscured. Their first meeting was in a conference room that smelled of coffee and legal texts. Evelyn dressed in a simple navy blue dress that cost more than Portia's monthly mortgage, but was worn without a hint of arrogance, laid out the story. She spoke not with bitterness, but with the quiet precision of an academic. She didn't talk about lonely nights or cancelled dinners. She talked about code, about mathematical models, about the architecture of an algorithm. He didn't steal a recipe for a cake. Ms. Kane. Evelyn finished, her hands resting calmly on the polished table. He took the blueprint for the entire factory. Portia listened, her pen motionless. When Evelyn was done, Portia looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Hayes, Evelyn. The prenup is on its face formidable. Alistair's lawyers at Whitman & Locke are the best money can buy. They will argue that Finch Capital is his creation, his labor, his genius. They will paint you as a kept woman who is now trying to cash in. I am aware of how I will be perceived, Evelyn said softly. To win, we can't just challenge the prenup. Portia continued, leaning forward. That's a losing battle. We have to recontextualize the entire marriage. We have to prove that Finch Capital isn't just a marital asset, but the product of a business partnership that predates the formal incorporation, a partnership where your intellectual property was the primary seed capital. We need to prove that the prenup itself was signed under fraudulent pretenses because he intentionally misrepresented the nature of the business's origins. Alistair's initial offer of $25 million was delivered via a sterile email from a junior associate at Whitman & Locke. It was rejected with a two-word response from Portia Kane, utterly unacceptable. This amused Alistair. He saw it as posturing. He instructed Arthur Vance to increase the offer to $35 million, plus the art collection, minus the Basquiat. Final offer, he'd snapped. The counter-proposal from Kane and Associates was not a number. It was a request for discovery that landed like a bomb on Arthur Vance's desk. It was dozens of pages long. It demanded access to Finch Capital's original source code, all server logs from its inception. Every version of the core analytical software, all internal emails between Alistair Finch and his original development team, and Evelyn's complete academic records and research papers from her postgraduate studies. Arthur Vance called Alistair immediately. This is not standard divorce procedure, he said, his voice laced with concern for the first time. This is a corporate deep dive. Her lawyer, this Portia Kane, she's not playing the spousal support game. She's coming for the company. Alistair laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Let her. There's nothing to find. The code has been rewritten 100 times over. The original servers are probably beer cans by now. It's a ghost hunt. Stall them. Bury them in paperwork. Bleed her dry. How much can she possibly have in her war chest? It was a question he should have asked himself more seriously. For 22 years, Evelyn had managed their household budgets with the same analytical mind that had designed Helios. She had saved, invested quietly, and built a small but significant fortune of her own, completely separate from Alistair's largesse. She wasn't just a scorned wife. She was a patient, well-funded adversary. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, the colossus of Whitman & Locke, armed with Alistair's billions and an iron-clad prenup. On the other, the boutique firm of Kane and Associates, armed with a quiet client, a shoebox full of old university notes, and a single explosive truth. Alistair, blinded by his own myth, saw it as a skirmish. He had no idea he was already standing on the epicenter of an earthquake of his own making. The discovery process was a war of attrition. Whitman & Locke, acting on Alistair's command, turned it into a masterclass in obfuscation. They delivered truckloads of documents, literally. Boxes upon boxes of printed-out irrelevant paperwork were sent to Portia Kane's office, a tactic designed to bury her small team and drain Evelyn's resources. They claimed original server logs were lost due to routine hardware upgrades. The company's original source code, they argued, was a trade secret of such monumental importance that revealing it even under seal would pose an existential threat to Finch Capital. Alistair watched the proceedings with detached amusement. He had hired a new younger interior designer named Katerina to refresh the penthouse, a clear and public signal that Evelyn's era was over. He was seen with Katerina at charity events, her youth and overt adoration a stark contrast to Evelyn's quiet dignity. The press ate it up, painting the narrative exactly as Alistair intended, the dynamic billionaire moving on from his staid older wife. Meanwhile, in a rented office space that smelled of ozone and dust, Evelyn and Portia's team were engaged in a digital archaeological dig. They had Evelyn's original handwritten notes from her postgraduate work, pages filled with complex equations and flowcharts that mapped out the logic of her Helios algorithm. The problem was linking these theoretical notes to the multi-billion-dollar machine that was Finch Capital. "They're stonewalling us on the source code, Evelyn," Portia said, one late night rubbing her tired eyes. They were surrounded by whiteboards covered in diagrams. "The judge is getting impatient. Without a direct link, your notes are just that, notes. We need a ghost in the machine. A fingerprint you left behind." Evelyn stared at a diagram she had drawn, a representation of the core logic loop of Helios. "When I first wrote it," she said slowly, her mind drifting back 2 decades, "I embedded a signature, a comment in the code. It was a line from a poem, from Ovid, Gutta cavat lapidem, a drop of water hollows a stone. It was a reminder to myself that persistent small efforts could solve a massive problem." Portia's eyes lit up. "A comment? That's perfect. It's non-functional. It would have no reason to be removed during a routine code update unless someone was actively trying to erase its origin." "But Alistair knew about it," Evelyn countered, her hope dimming. "He used to joke about my sentimental code. It would have been one of the first things he'd have instructed his programmers to scrub." The key, they realized, wasn't just in the code, but in the people. Portia's investigators began tracking down the original programmers who worked at Finch Capital in its infancy. Most had signed draconian non-disclosure agreements and were either too scared or too well compensated to talk. One name, however, stood out: Gregory Shaw. He was Alistair's first chief technology officer, the man tasked with turning Evelyn's academic algorithm into a commercial product. Gregory had left Finch Capital 10 years ago under a cloud of rumors. Some said he'd had a falling out with Alistair. Others said he'd cashed out and simply retired. He now lived a quiet life in rural Vermont, running a small artisanal woodworking shop. Portia flew to Vermont herself. She found Gregory in a barn that smelled of sawdust and pine. His hands, once deft on a keyboard, now covered in wood stain. He was wary, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. "I'm not interested in getting involved in Alistair's dramas," Gregory said, not looking up from a piece of maple he was sanding. "This isn't about drama, Mr. Shaw," Portia said calmly. "It's about attribution. It's about Evelyn Hayes." At the mention of Evelyn's name, Gregory stopped sanding. He looked at Portia for the first time, his eyes holding a deep, ancient weariness. "Evelyn," he said, the name sounding foreign on his lips. "I haven't thought about those days in a long time. We believe her original algorithm Helios contained a digital signature, a line from Ovid," Portia pressed gently. Gregory put the piece of wood down and wiped his hands on a rag. "Gutta cavat lapidem," he murmured, a ghost of a smile on his face. Yes, it was there, elegant. We all admired it. He paused, his expression hardening. And yes, Alistair ordered it removed, along with any other academic artifacts. He wanted the code to be sterile. His. "Can you testify to that?" Portia asked, her heart pounding. Gregory shook his head. "It's my word against his. Alistair would bury me in litigation. He'd paint me as a disgruntled employee." It seemed like another dead end. Portia returned to New York, dejected. But her visit had stirred something in Gregory Shaw. For 10 years he had lived with the quiet shame of his complicity. He had watched Alistair take sole credit for a piece of genius that wasn't his, and he had taken a handsome payout to remain silent. A week later, a small anonymous package arrived at Portia Kane's office. Inside was a single old-school zip disk and a handwritten note with 3 words, "Check the metadata." Portia's tech team, a pair of brilliant young forensic analysts, carefully accessed the contents of the disk. It contained what appeared to be an early archived backup of the Finch Capital code base. When they ran a search for the Ovid line, they found nothing. It had been scrubbed just as Gregory had said. "It's a bust," one of the analysts said, disappointed. But Evelyn, who was in the room, leaned closer to the screen. "Wait. Don't search the content. Search the file properties, the comments." The analyst clicked through the file system, opening up the metadata for the primary executable file. And there, in the comments field of the file properties, a field no one ever bothered to look at, was a single entry. It wasn't the poem. It was a developer's note, time-stamped from the company's first year of operation. The note read, "Per AF directive scrubbed Ovid SIG from Helios module, recompiling core, final pre-launch build. GS, AF, Alistair Finch, GS, Gregory Shaw, Helios." It was everything. It wasn't the poem itself, but something far better, a digital receipt for the act of erasure. A direct time-stamped order from Alistair, documented by his own CTO, to remove the very signature Evelyn had described. It was the ghost in the machine, and it had just handed them the keys to the kingdom. Portia Kane looked at Evelyn, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "The stone," she said, "is starting to hollow." The Honorable Judge Marion Shaw, a woman with a reputation for sharp intellect and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, presided over the case. The courtroom was packed. The financial press, initially treating the divorce as celebrity gossip, was now present in force, sensing a story with far deeper implications for the business world. Alistair Finch arrived each day, looking impeccable and unbothered. He would nod curtly to his team of 4 lawyers from Whitman and Locke, take his seat, and proceed to check his Patek Philippe watch as if he had a more important meeting to attend. He radiated an aura of supreme confidence, the master of the universe, tolerating a brief, irritating visit to a lesser planet. Evelyn, by contrast, was a study in stillness. She sat beside Portia Kane, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. She didn't fidget. She didn't react to the whispers from the gallery. She simply watched, her gaze fixed on the proceedings with an unnerving intensity. The first days of the trial went as Alistair expected. His lawyers painted a compelling picture of his genius. They called witness after witness, board members, executives, industry analysts, who all testified to Alistair's singular vision and relentless drive. They presented Finch Capital's growth charts, its staggering profits, its market dominance. The narrative was clear. This was the house that Alistair built. Arthur Vance, in his opening statement, had characterized Evelyn's claim as a desperate revisionist history from a woman who enjoyed a life of unimaginable luxury and now seeks to claim credit for a world she never understood. When Alistair took the stand, he was charming, powerful, and dismissive. Under direct examination from his own lawyer, he recounted the founding of his company with practiced ease. "Yes, my former wife was a student when we met," he said, his tone patronizing. "She was bright, of course, but her work was purely academic, theoretical. It had no practical application. The engine of Finch Capital, the proprietary model we use, was something my team and I developed over years of hard work, trial and error in the real world." Then it was Portia Kane's turn to cross-examine. She approached the witness stand not with aggression, but with a calm, almost surgical demeanor. "Mr. Finch," she began, "you've stated that your wife's work was purely theoretical. Can you describe for the court the fundamental principles of your company's analytical model?" Alistair smirked. "I'm not going to divulge trade secrets in open court, Ms. Kane. I'm not asking for the code, Mr. Finch. I'm asking for the theory. Is it not based on assessing undervalued assets by analyzing non-linear risk factors?" Alistair hesitated for a fraction of a second. "That is a component, yes. A component you first learned about from Evelyn Hayes's postgraduate thesis, correct?" "I may have read her papers, yes. I was supportive of her studies. Supportive enough to use her core concepts as the foundation for your entire company. That's an absurd accusation." Alistair scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Many people were exploring similar ideas at the time." Portia walked back to her table and picked up a bound document. "This is a copy of your wife's thesis, Mr. Finch, the one she never completed because she left her PhD program to support you. On page 87, she outlines a specific logic loop for processing market data volatility. Can you explain to the court how that differs from the initial logic loop used in Finch Capital's first software build?" The lawyers from Whitman and Locke jumped to their feet, shouting objections. Speculation calls for expert testimony. The witness is not a software engineer. Judge Shaw sustained the objection, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Portia continued chipping away at his story piece by piece. She brought up his initial tiny office, his lack of startup capital, his absence of any prior coding or advanced mathematical experience. The climax of the day, the moment that would be endlessly replayed on news clips, came during Evelyn's testimony. She took the stand. Her voice quiet but clear. She didn't speak of betrayal or heartache. She spoke like a scientist. She explained her algorithm, Helios, its name, its purpose. She described showing it to Alistair, his excitement, his promises of partnership. As she spoke, Alistair watched her, his mask of bored indifference beginning to slip. He saw a woman he did not recognize. This was not the silent, compliant wife who organized his dinner parties. This was the brilliant, focused woman he had met decades ago, the one whose mind had so fascinated him before he decided her utility had expired. Evelyn was explaining the digital signature she had embedded in the code, the line from Ovid. "It was my way of signing my work," she said simply. "A little piece of me inside the logic." It was at that moment that Alistair did it. Perhaps it was the stress, the public challenge to his carefully constructed myth, or simple, unadulterated arrogance. As Evelyn spoke of her little piece of his empire, he looked over at his lead counsel, Arthur Vance, and rolled his eyes. It was a slow, deliberate, contemptuous gesture, a silent communication that said, "Can you believe this nonsense?" He thought it was a private moment. He was wrong. Every single member of the jury saw it. Judge Shaw saw it. Her lips tightening into a thin, hard line, The journalists in the press gallery saw it, and their fingers flew across their keyboards. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated hubris. In that single fleeting gesture, he had confirmed everything Portia Kane had been arguing, that he saw his wife not as a partner, but as an irrelevant nuisance. He had dismissed her on the stand in open court, just as he had dismissed her in life. Portia Kane paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. She looked at the jury, then at the judge. She knew that single eye roll might be more powerful than any piece of evidence she had. She let the silence hang for a moment longer before turning back to Evelyn. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice now filled with a quiet fire, "let's talk about what happened to your signature. Let's talk about what Mr. Finch ordered his team to erase." She walked to her table, and with a theatricality that she had until this point avoided, she picked up a single plastic zip disk. "Your Honor, we would like to present Exhibit D, an archived backup from Finch Capital's initial server, and with it, the testimony of its creator, Mr. Gregory Shaw, who has agreed to testify tomorrow." Alistair Finch's face went pale. He stared at the disk, then at the placid, unreadable face of his wife. For the first time since the proceedings began, the titan of industry looked not just bothered, but scared. The empire wasn't just being challenged. Its very foundations were about to be exposed. The tension in the courtroom the next morning was a palpable force. Alistair Finch's usual air of nonchalance was gone, replaced by a rigid, coiled anger. He sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, barely speaking to the anxious huddle of his lawyers. The press gallery was overflowing, buzzing with anticipation. The story had exploded overnight. "The Billionaire's eye roll" was the headline on every news blog. Gregory Shaw took the stand. He was no longer the rustic woodworker from Vermont. He was dressed in a simple, dark suit, his face serious, his demeanor grave. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a long-held secret. Portia Kane began her examination, gently establishing Gregory's credentials, his role as the first CTO of Finch Capital, his intimate knowledge of the company's foundational code. Then she guided him back to the beginning. "Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice echoing in the silent room, "can you describe the software you were hired to commercialize?" "It was based on an algorithm I was told was named Helios," Gregory stated, his voice clear and steady. "It was brilliant, elegant, predictive, unlike anything I'd seen. It was the reason the company had a future." "And who did you understand the author of this Helios algorithm to be?" Whitman and Locke's lead counsel shot to his feet. "Objection, hearsay. Overruled," Judge Shaw said instantly. "The witness is testifying to his understanding in his capacity as CTO at the time. He may answer." Gregory looked directly at the jury. "Alistair told me it was a model developed by his then-girlfriend, Evelyn Hayes, a mathematics postgrad at Columbia." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Alistair stared daggers at Gregory, a look of pure venom in his eyes. Gregory didn't flinch. "Now, Mr. Shaw," Portia continued, her pacing deliberate, "let's talk about the code itself. Did you notice any unusual features within it?" "Yes," Gregory replied. "There was a commented-out line of code in the main module. It wasn't functional, just a piece of text. It read, 'Gutta cavat lapidem.' And did there come a time when you were given instructions regarding this line of text?" "Yes, in the final weeks before the official company launch, Mr. Finch gave me a direct verbal order." Gregory paused, taking a deep breath. "He told me to scrub all the academic crap out of the code. He specifically mentioned the Ovid line. He said, 'I want this to be clean. I want it to be mine. No confusion about its origin.' Those were his exact words." And what did you do? I followed his order. I removed the line. Portia walked to the clerk and retrieved the zip disk, now marked as Exhibit D. Your Honor, I present a zip disk provided to my office by a confidential source. Mr. Shaw. Can you identify it? Gregory looked at the disk. That appears to be one of the backup disks I made during that period. I was meticulous about archiving a habit Alistair found annoying. Portia projected the contents of the disk onto the large screens in the courtroom. She navigated to the file system, showing the scrubbed code absent the Ovid line. Alistair's lawyers began to look relieved. This proved nothing. Mr. Shaw, Portia said, her voice ringing with authority. Did you make any other record of Mr. Finch's order? An order like that to deliberately remove what I considered to be an author's signature. It felt wrong, Gregory said, his gaze unwavering. So I documented it. Not in an email. Alistair was paranoid about paper trails even then. I made a note in a place I was certain no one would ever look. Portia's cursor moved on the screen. It hovered over the primary executable file, the compiled heart of the program. She right-clicked, then selected Properties. A dialog box appeared. She clicked on the Summary tab. And there it was, for the entire court to see projected 10 feet high. A small overlooked text field labeled Comments. Inside it, the time-stamped note, per AF directive, scrubbed Ovid sig from Helios module. Recompiling core. Final pre-launch build. GS. It was the Rosetta Stone of Alistair's great lie. A digital artifact perfectly preserved that documented not just the existence of Evelyn's signature, but the explicit intentional act of its removal ordered by Alistair Finch himself. It proved everything. It proved Evelyn's authorship. It proved Alistair's knowledge of that authorship, and it proved his intent to conceal it, to claim her genius as his own. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Arthur Vance, Alistair's lead lawyer, sank into his chair, his face ashen. He looked at his client, who was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The bravado, the arrogance, the carefully constructed myth of the self-made man. It had all evaporated in the glow of a single line of text from a 2-decade-old metadata field. Portia Kane let the image hang on the screen, a silent monument to Evelyn's vindication. She turned not to the witness, but to face Alistair Finch directly. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You called my client's claims absurd. You told this court her work was theoretical. You rolled your eyes at the very mention of her contribution. Does this," she said, gesturing to the screen, "look theoretical to you? Or does it look like fraud?" Alistair Finch said nothing. He simply stared at the screen, at the ghost in the machine that had come back to haunt him. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire titan. He was just a man who had been caught. The gavel was about to fall, and he knew with chilling certainty that it would not be a quiet sound. The days following the reveal of the metadata felt like a slow-motion demolition. Alistair Finch's legal team, once a formidable wall, now looked like a pile of rubble. Their motions were listless, their objections half-hearted. The energy had been sucked out of their case, replaced by the grim reality of inevitable defeat. The trial concluded swiftly. Closing arguments were a formality. Portia Kane methodically pieced together the narrative from Evelyn's brilliant thesis to Alistair's calculated erasure, culminating in the damning evidence from the zip disk. "This case," Portia concluded, her gaze sweeping across the jury, "is not about a marriage ending. It is about a partnership that was never honored. It is not about a wife seeking alimony. It is about a founder seeking her rightful stake in the empire she helped create. Evelyn Hayes is not asking for a piece of Alistair Finch's success. She is demanding her share of their success. When Arthur Vance gave his closing, it was a pale shadow of his confident opening. He spoke of Alistair's business acumen, his years of work, but he couldn't erase the image of the metadata note. He couldn't undo the eye roll. He was trying to wallpaper over a crater. It took the jury less than 3 hours. The final day in court was a media circus. Alistair arrived looking haggard. The Brioni suit was still perfect, but the man inside it was frayed. He had dark circles under his eyes, and the hand that held his briefcase trembled slightly. Evelyn entered with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout, but now there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Judge Marion Shaw entered, and a hush fell over the room. She looked at the jury foreman, then at the documents in her hand. She dispensed with the usual preamble, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. On the matter of the prenuptial agreement, Judge Shaw began. This court finds that the agreement was predicated on a fraudulent misrepresentation of the foundational assets of the business known as Finch Capital. Mr. Finch knowingly and deliberately concealed the material contribution of Ms. Hayes, thereby rendering the terms concerning the division of business assets null and void. Alistair flinched as if he'd been struck. His entire defense, his ironclad shield, had just been vaporized. Judge Shaw continued, her eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on Evelyn. This court finds that Ms. Hayes was not merely a supportive spouse, but a de facto founding partner of Finch Capital. Her intellectual property, the algorithm codenamed Helios, constituted the primary and essential seed capital for the venture. She paused, letting the words sink in. The silence was absolute. Alistair stared at the judge, his mouth slightly agape, a look of utter incomprehension on his face. This was not happening. This could not be happening. Then Judge Shaw delivered the final devastating blow. She looked past the lawyers, past the gallery, directly at Evelyn Hayes, who sat perfectly still. Therefore, the judge declared, her voice ringing with finality, the court rules that the entirety of Finch Capital and all its subsidiary assets are to be considered joint property. Pursuant to the laws of this state regarding the dissolution of a partnership without a valid operating agreement, the assets are to be divided equally. She looked at Alistair, then back to Evelyn, and then came the words that would echo across Wall Street for years to come. "Ma'am," Judge Shaw said, a flicker of something that might have been respect in her eyes. "You own half his assets now." The sound in the room was a sudden, sharp intake of breath from 100 different people. Alistair Finch simply stared, his face turning a blotchy red. The theatrical eye roll in court felt like a lifetime ago. He had rolled his eyes at the woman who was now, by judicial decree, his equal partner, a 50% owner of his life's work. The woman he had erased now held the power to erase him. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane, an outrage!" he roared, his voice cracking. "I will appeal. I will bury you in appeals until you are dust." "Mr. Finch, control yourself," Judge Shaw ordered, banging her gavel, but the sound was lost in the chaos. Reporters were scrambling, shouting questions. Alistair's lawyers were trying to restrain him. Through it all, Evelyn Hayes did not move. She didn't smile in triumph. She didn't cry in relief. She simply watched the man who had tried to make her invisible completely unravel. As he was led away by his legal team, still shouting threats, his eyes met hers across the courtroom. In his gaze, she saw shock, rage, and for the first time in 22 years, raw, undiluted fear. The immediate fallout was cataclysmic. News of the verdict hit the markets like a shockwave. Finch Capital's stock, where it was publicly traded in subsidiary forms, plummeted. Lenders grew nervous. Competitors like Blackstone and KKR began circling like sharks that smelled blood in the water. Alistair's net worth was effectively cleaved in two, a loss of billions of dollars in a single sentence. That evening, Evelyn sat not in the silent penthouse, but in Portia Kane's office, sipping a cup of tea. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly with calls from bankers, wealth managers, and journalists. "He'll fight," Evelyn said quietly, looking out at the city lights. "He won't let this go." "Let him try," Portia replied, raising her own cup in a toast. "He thinks this is the end of the war. He doesn't realize you've only just begun to fight. You're not just a wealthy woman now, Evelyn. You are a market force. You are Finch Capital. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" It was a question Evelyn had been asking herself for months, and for the first time, she had an answer. This was never just about the money. It was about reclaiming her story. And now she had the power to write the next chapter herself. Alistair Finch, cornered and humiliated, did not retreat to lick his wounds. He instead chose to set the world on fire. His first act as a deposed king was to go on the offensive, launching a scorched earth campaign designed not just to challenge the verdict, but to utterly destroy Evelyn's credibility. He appeared on a prime-time segment with a belligerent financial news anchor, his face a mask of practiced victimhood. "This is a travesty of justice," Alistair declared, leaning into the camera, a complete stranger. A judge with no business acumen has handed half of a complex financial institution to a woman who, with all due respect, has spent the last 2 decades picking out floral arrangements. She doesn't understand the market. She understands Sotheby's catalogues. The company is in mortal danger. He painted her as emotionally unstable, vindictive, a woman scorned and dangerously incompetent. Simultaneously, his legal team, now on a retainer that bled millions from his accounts each week, filed an emergency injunction to freeze all major executive actions at Finch Capital. Their motion argued that Evelyn's inexperienced meddling posed an imminent threat to shareholder value. It was a transparent attempt to paralyze the company, to make it impossible for Evelyn to govern, hoping the ensuing chaos would force a more favorable settlement. He then began personally calling his most loyal division heads, offering them lavish bonuses and equity in a new venture he planned to start, trying to orchestrate a mass exodus that would leave Finch Capital a hollowed-out shell. This was the Alistair Evelyn knew when his authority was challenged. He sought not to win, but to annihilate. But he was fighting a memory. The real Evelyn Hayes was already several moves ahead. The court dismissed his injunction within 48 hours, with the judge sharply admonishing Alistair's counsel for filing a frivolous and vindictive motion. It was his first post-verdict defeat, a small but significant sign that the legal system's patience with him was wearing thin. While he was playing to the cameras, Evelyn was quietly playing chess. She completely ignored his media tour, denying him the public dogfight he craved. Instead, she focused on stabilizing the ship. Her first, most critical move was securing new leadership. She flew to Chicago to have dinner with Anneliese Richter, a legendary figure at Morgan Stanley, known for her icy nerves and brilliant strategic mind. Over a quiet meal, Evelyn didn't rehash the divorce. She spoke of the future, Alistair built a company that feeds on weakness. Evelyn explained her passion for the subject evident. It buys, strips, and sells. It creates profit, but not value. The core engine Helios was designed to find hidden potential, not to identify targets for demolition. I want to take the company back to that principle, to invest, to build, to innovate, to be a partner to the companies we acquire, not a predator. Annalise, who had seen countless corporate titans, was intrigued. She saw in Evelyn not a scorned wife, but a founder with a clear, compelling, and most importantly, potentially more profitable, long-term vision. The offer was a massive gamble, but it was also the chance to reshape a major Wall Street player from the ground up. By the end of the week, Annalise Richter's shocking resignation from Morgan Stanley and her appointment as the new CEO of Finch Capital was the talk of the financial world. It was a massive vote of confidence in Evelyn. While Annalise calmed the markets, Evelyn and Gregory Shaw worked on the soul of the company. They greenlit the creation of Helios Labs, a well-funded R&D division tasked with building the next generation of the algorithm. Evelyn herself was a constant presence there, not as an executive, but as a collaborator, her old mathematical brilliance sparking back to life as she worked with the young, eager coders they'd hired. The true battle came to a head 3 months later. Alistair, furious at his inability to destabilize the company from the outside, initiated a hostile proxy fight to seize control of the board of directors. He put forth his own slate of candidates, hand-picked loyalists who would rubber-stamp his agenda. It was an all-or-nothing bid to oust Evelyn and Annalise and reclaim his throne. This was the war he understood. But Evelyn was now fighting on his turf. Guided by Annalise, she embarked on a grueling roadshow meeting with the notoriously pragmatic managers of the massive pension funds endowments and institutional investors who held the largest blocks of Finch Capital stock. In sterile boardrooms from Boston to San Francisco, Alistair's team presented a narrative of chaos and incompetence. Evelyn and Annalise presented charts. They showed the company's stabilized stock price, the renewed lines of credit, the blueprint for Helios 2.0, and sober, compelling projections for sustainable growth. They sold competence, not drama. The tipping point came from an unexpected quarter. Their son Nathan, who had watched the entire ordeal with growing dismay, issued a public statement. He spoke of his mother's quiet brilliance, which he had witnessed his entire life, and announced he would be taking a junior analyst position at Helios Labs. "I believe in the vision my mother has for this company," he wrote. A vision of building, not breaking. It was a devastating personal and public blow to Alistair's narrative. The shareholder meeting was held in a tense hotel ballroom. Alistair sat with his team looking confident, but the slight tick in his jaw betrayed his anxiety. When the independent auditor stepped to the podium to announce the results of the proxy vote, the room was silent. Evelyn's slate of directors had won not by a narrow margin, but by a landslide of over 70%. The institutional money had spoken. They had chosen Evelyn's future over Alistair's past. He had been defeated publicly and overwhelmingly by the very rules of the corporate world he revered. A week later, he requested a meeting. He entered the 60th floor boardroom to find Evelyn, Annalise, and Gregory waiting for him. The fight was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out weariness. He even tried a different tactic, a ghost of the charm he used to wield so effectively. "Ev," he began, his voice soft. "Look at this view. Think of what we built. Together. Don't let it end like this." Evelyn looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It didn't have to end like this, Alistair. But your choices after the verdict made this outcome inevitable. She pushed a thick, bound document across the polished mahogany table. This isn't an emotional appeal. This is a balance sheet. Inside was a detailed analysis compiled by Annalise's team. It showed in stark, undeniable figures the cost of his war, the millions in legal fees, the drop in stock value directly attributable to his media attacks, and the proxy battle, the cost of the talent he'd tried and mostly failed to poach. Your actions have cost this company an estimated $900 million in enterprise value. Evelyn said, her voice clinical, precise. You have actively damaged the asset you were fighting for. She then slid a second, much thinner folder across the table. This is the board's formal offer to buy out your 50% stake. The price is based on today's valuation, a valuation you yourself helped to diminish. It's enough for you to live any life you want. But you will be out. Completely. He stared at the documents, the numbers swimming before his eyes. It was a checkmate, delivered not with passion, but with cold, hard math. He had been beaten by the two things he thought he owned his company, and the woman he had dismissed. With a hand that trembled with suppressed rage, he uncapped a pen, flipped to the last page of the buyout agreement, and signed his name. He didn't say another word. He simply stood up, a ghost in the house he had built, and walked out of the boardroom and out of their lives forever. Evelyn watched him go, then took a deep breath. She didn't look at the buyout agreement. She looked at Gregory and Annalise. A slow smile spread across her face. Well, she said, I believe Helios Labs has a budgeted meeting. Let's get to work. She was no longer just the owner of half his assets. She was the sole architect of her own, and a new, more thoughtful empire was just beginning to rise. And so Evelyn Hayes's story serves as a powerful, real-world reminder that a person's worth can never be truly erased, no matter how deeply it's buried. It's a testament to the fact that intellect, patience, and unwavering belief in one's own truth can be the most formidable assets of all. Alistair Finch's empire was built on a lie, and in the end, it was the quiet, persistent truth that brought the walls crashing down. It wasn't about a wife taking half. It was about a creator reclaiming her masterpiece. This story shows us that the most significant victories aren't always loud, but they are the ones that reshape the world and restore a balance that was long overdue. If this story of justice and vindication resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your own narrative. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into stories where the underestimated rise up and change everything. Thank you for listening.